Okay, so welcome back to Comm 170. This lesson acts as an introduction to Michel Foucault, discourse, and post-structuralism. We're covering this to answer the question, what came after structuralism? Going back to structuralism, we can summarize it as a French intellectual movement which analyzed language and culture as a system of signs. It's a mode of thought which studies systems and looks for underlying structures, and a method of analysis concerned with systems of meaning. Structuralism assumes that there is an internal and identifiable logic holding language and meaning together. Structuralism was a powerful tool, and very popular in analysis for a long time, but it was not without faults or detractors. Some claimed it was anti-humanistic and ahistorical, whereby communication seemed like it was a simple act of decoding and where power dynamics were ignored, and another complaint was that it reduced all of human experience to the system of language, which brought us to post-structuralism, which called forth new ideas and new thoughts with regard to how languages work and how communication works. Question 1. How does post-structuralism need structuralism to make sense? So what is post-structuralism? Well, it's a group of thoughts which challenge what structuralism brought to prominence. The thing about structuralism is that it had static, concrete understandings of language at its core. Post-structuralism, which is not really a unified movement but more a set of trends and opinions, were to explain how structures in language were flawed, contradictory, and confusing in many cases. So, it created room for ambivalence and ambiguity. So the simple decoding part of structuralism was never going to be that simple. Post-structuralism looked at text in a self-reflexive manner. They looked at how language was slippery and difficult, words and translations and context and meanings and metaphors, and also pointed out the same ambiguity in considering the relationships between text, context, and meanings. Like many of the ideas we've talked about, post-structuralism can also be defined by what it is not and what it works against. It's not about totalizing concepts or one key variable is the cause. For example, if a story was about a poor person, a post-structuralist analysis wouldn't necessarily say, if you figure out the economic part of this, you understand every single thing about the text. It was against the idea of there being one massive truth with a capital T. There was not a reality that existed outside of language or ideology. Stability in representations and meaning was not something the post-structuralists believed in. Things were very much dependent upon context and circumstances and ideology. What was happening around and in and through the text? What was informing it? And this brings us to one of the most cited figures, and one of the most misunderstood figures, of late 20th century academia, Michel Foucault. Question 2. What is a genealogical approach according to Foucault? So, Foucault was French, born in 1926. He earned degrees in philosophy and psychology and wrote several very popular books. Still very widely cited and very widely read in the humanities, as well as other fields. Foucault wrote about a lot of interesting topics: prisons, hospitals, asylums, the military. But one of his main concerns, and one of his biggest themes, was power, and how power works in relation to knowledge, discourse, and the formation and the nature of the subject. The lecture, The Discourse on Language, acts as an introduction to his theoretical project, and allows us to look at discourse, which we can broadly define as anything written, said, or communicated using signs, and which is concerned specifically with specialized or institutional knowledge, and how it differs from language. If language is a system of symbols and signs and has rules of grammar and structure, it's in the realm of the law, right? But if we consider discourse as parole, we can see how it follows different rules, involves power relationships, and is political and partisan in nature. And see again, there's those structural terms rearing their heads. So, when looking at discourse, we can consider it a mere utterance, a serious speech act, like what experts say when they are speaking of experts, and the presence of subjugated knowledge, that which is not said out loud. With regard to discourse and knowledge, Foucault wrote, quote, "I'm supposing that in every society, the production of discourse is at once controlled, selected, organized, and redistributed according to a certain number of procedures, whose role is to avert its powers and its dangers to cope with chance events, to evade its ponderous, awesome materiality." And that's from page 216. Question 3. How do you think Foucault's ideas could be applied to rhetoric? Foucault is concerned with what discourse does, how it both prohibits and enables, divides and joins, according to specific rules. He He writes on page 216 that, quote, "In every society, the production of discourse is at once controlled, selected, organized, and redistributed according to a certain number of procedures." Foucault also writes, quote, "In appearance, speech may well be of little account, but the prohibitions surrounding it soon reveal its links with desire and power," on the same page. To summarize it, discourse, in terms of what it does, provides limits on what can and can't be said. From here we can ask an important question. Who can make discourse? Who is able to participate in discourse production? On page 219, Foucault writes, "I believe that this will to knowledge, thus reliant upon institutional support and distribution, tends to exercise a sort of pressure, a power of constraint upon other forms of discourse." Discourse had rituals and relationships which in turn informed those same rituals. When we look at discourse, we can look at one's privilege and one's right to speak on a particular subject, the surrounding circumstances of the situation wherein and whereby that discourse was produced, and the roles of institutions and disciplines in terms of how they relate to discourse. Here's an important quote. "Whether it's the philosophy of a founding subject, a philosophy of originating experience, or a philosophy of universal mediation, discourse is really only an activity, of writing in the first case, of reading in the second, and exchange in the third. This exchange, this writing, this reading never involve anything but signs. Discourse thus nullifies itself, in reality, in placing itself at the disposal of the signifier." One key thing Foucault wrote about, which is very much in keeping with the post-structural non-movement, if you can call it that, was exclusion. And in the Discourse on Language, he discusses 3 methods about how discourse prohibits on page 216. Here he talks about and addresses exclusions on what is spoken, how it can be spoken about, and who can speak about something. He also writes about opposition of the speech of reason to the speech of madness, as well as the will to truth and the opposition between true and false. And while this is certainly not a very thorough summation, and nowhere near a complete one, that's a really long reading and you should spend some time with it, it all speaks to Foucault's insights and his willingness to look at some of these under-questioned assumptions about how language and discourse relate to one another. In simpler terms, Foucault looked at things in a very exciting way, and it turned out to be very influential and very captivating to a lot of scholars and critics. Looking at his thoughts on discipline and commentary provides a great example of why he was important, with Foucault stating, quote, "Disciplines constitute a system of control in the production of discourse, fixing its limits through the action of an identity taking the form of a permanent reactivation of the rules. Analyzing discourse would question our will to truth, conceptualize discourse as an event, and abolish the sovereignty of the signifier." And again, the signifier is a major structural component. Foucault's methods of analysis give us a critical and a genealogical method, and he worked to, quote, "attempt to distinguish forms of exclusion, limitation, and appropriation." He wanted to, quote, "show how they are formed, in answer to which needs, how they are modified and displaced." And while interrogating how series of discourses are formed, he wanted to look at what system of constraints informed them. What were specific norms, conditions of appearance, growth, and variation which affected discourse? Now, to bring this to a close, we should clarify why we're talking about Foucault. And again, to be 100% honest, this is a very broad introduction to Foucault's thoughts. It's true Foucault is not a rhetorician. He is a historically oriented philosopher concerned with the force of discourse in society and how it is situated in institutions. So why are we looking at it? Because his influence was very, very profound in the field of communication, and also because rhetoric can gain important insights by looking at Foucault's thoughts on discourse. Foucault's work expands upon discourse and adds in dimensions of power to rhetorical analysis. It attends to the negative, or what is not said, as much as to what is said, and thus means we have stronger tools to work with. So there you go. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out, and I'll see you online.